At my gold-digging granddaughter's wedding, I noticed my name tag said, "The Forgotten Old Lady." I smiled and walked in. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and let me know where you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this truth travels." I had always believed weddings were sacred, not just ceremonies with flowers and music, but moments where family showed who they truly were, when love was supposed to stand taller than pride and gratitude louder than silence. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual. At 71, I don't rush much anymore. But that day, I took my time with everything. I stood in front of my closet longer than I had in years, my fingers brushing over dresses I hadn't worn since my husband passed. Robert used to say I looked my best in soft gold tones. It brought out the warmth in my skin, he'd say, even when I didn't believe him. So I chose that dress, a modest, elegant gown with delicate lace along the sleeves. I paired it with the pearl necklace he gave me on our 40th anniversary. I hadn't worn it since the funeral, not because I didn't want to, but because some memories are too heavy to carry into ordinary days. Today didn't feel ordinary. Today was my granddaughter Emily's wedding. I had helped raise that girl. When her parents were busy building their careers, I was the one who packed her lunches, braided her hair, stayed up with her through fevers and nightmares. I was there for the school plays, the scraped knees, the heartbreaks she didn't want to tell her parents about. And when she got engaged, I was the one she called first. "Grandma," she had said, her voice trembling with excitement. "I want you to be there for everything." And I was. Every dress fitting, every vendor meeting, every last-minute crisis when something went wrong, and something always does. I didn't just attend that wedding. I helped build it. The venue alone cost more than what Robert and I paid for our first house back in 1978. A grand ballroom in a luxury hotel downtown, with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Emily had expensive taste, but I never complained. When my son mentioned they were a little tight on budget, I quietly transferred the money. Not once, not twice, but enough times that I stopped keeping track. It wasn't about the money. It was about family. At least, that's what I told myself. When I arrived at the hotel, the lobby was already buzzing with guests. Women in silk dresses, men in tailored suits, laughter echoing off marble floors. Everything looked polished. Perfect. Just like the pictures Emily had shown me. I made my way to the check-in table near the ballroom entrance, where a young woman stood behind a neatly arranged set of name cards. "Good afternoon," she said with a bright, professional smile. "Name, please." "Margaret Lawson," I replied. She flipped through the cards quickly, then pulled one out and handed it to me. "Here you go. Enjoy the celebration." I took the card without thinking, but as I glanced down, my steps slowed. At first, I thought I had misread it. Maybe the lighting was off. Maybe my eyes, not as sharp as they used to be, were playing tricks on me. So I stopped, and I looked again. In elegant, flowing script, printed clearly across the card, were the words, "The Forgotten Old Lady." For a moment, everything around me faded. The music, the chatter, the clinking glasses, all of it blurred into a distant hum, like I was underwater. I stood there, holding that card between my fingers, feeling something cold settle deep in my chest. Forgotten. Old. Lady. 3 words. Simple. Polite, even. But placed together like that, they cut deeper than anything shouted in anger. Because this wasn't a mistake. Mistakes are random. This was intentional. I lifted my head slowly and looked around the room. No one seemed to notice. Or maybe they did, and chose not to say anything. A group of women near the entrance glanced in my direction, then quickly looked away, their lips twitching as if they were holding back smiles. I felt it then. Not confusion. Not embarrassment. Something quieter. Something sharper. Understanding. I could have gone back to the table. Could have asked for a different card. Could have made a scene. But I didn't. Instead, I pinned it to my dress. Carefully. Deliberately. As if it belonged there. Then I straightened my shoulders and walked into the ballroom. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let people believe you don't see what they've done. Not yet. Not until it matters. The ballroom was even more beautiful than I remembered from the brochures. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling, casting soft golden light over everything. Round tables draped in ivory linen filled the space, each one decorated with towering floral arrangements, white roses, orchids, and and something imported that I couldn't even name. It smelled expensive. That's the only way I can describe it. A mixture of fresh flowers, polished wood, and the faint trace of champagne already being poured. I stepped further inside, my heels sinking slightly into the thick carpet, and for a brief moment, I let myself take it all in. This was the wedding I had helped pay for. Every detail, every petal, every glass. And yet, I had never felt more out of place in my own family. I adjusted the small name tag pinned to my chest, feeling its weight more than its size. It wasn't heavy, but it carried something far more difficult than paper. Meaning, I walked past a group of guests near the bar. Their laughter was loud, easy, effortless. One of them glanced at me, her eyes flicking briefly to my name tag before returning to her conversation. But not before I saw it. That look, that quick spark of recognition, followed by something else. Amusement. I kept walking. Because at my age, you learn something important. People rarely hide what they think. They just assume you're too old to notice. I found my table near the back of the room. Not surprising. The card on the table read, Table 12, tucked discreetly beside a centerpiece so tall it partially blocked the view of the stage. From where I stood, I could barely see the dance floor, let alone the head table where the bride and groom would sit. I ran my fingers lightly along the edge of the chair before pulling it out. No one else had arrived yet. Or perhaps, no one else was assigned here. I sat down slowly, smoothing my dress over my knees, keeping my posture straight. Years of habit, years of teaching myself to remain composed, even when everything inside me felt anything but steady. From across the room, I spotted my son, Daniel. He stood near the center of the ballroom, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, a glass of champagne in his hand. He looked comfortable, confident, at ease in a world that seemed so far removed from the one I had known when I was his age. He wasn't alone. Next to him stood his wife, Linda, my daughter-in-law. She looked exactly as she always did, polished, controlled, smiling just enough to seem warm without ever being approachable. Her eyes scanned the room like she was assessing it, not enjoying it. Assessing. I watched as someone approached them, another guest, perhaps a business associate. Linda leaned in slightly, speaking with quiet confidence, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, as if to remind everyone exactly where her place was, and where mine wasn't. For a moment, I considered standing up, walking over, saying something, anything. But then I remembered the name tag, the forgotten old lady, and I stayed seated. Because sometimes, people tell you exactly who they think you are, if you're willing to listen. A server passed by with a tray of champagne flutes. He paused beside me politely. "Would you like one, ma'am?" I nodded. "Thank you." I took the glass carefully, my fingers steady even though my chest felt tight. I didn't drink it. I just held it. Across the room, I saw Emily, my granddaughter, the bride. She stood near the stage, surrounded by bridesmaids, her white gown shimmering under the lights. She looked beautiful, radiant, exactly how a bride should look on her wedding day. For a moment, something in my chest softened. Because no matter what, I still loved her. I watched as she laughed, her head tilting back slightly the same way it used to when she was a child. For a split second, I didn't see the grown woman in the designer dress. I saw the little girl who used to run into my arms after school. "Grandma, guess what happened today?" I had lived for those moments. And now, I wasn't even sure she would come over to my table. As if on cue, she glanced in my direction. Our eyes met, just for a second. And in that second, I searched her face for something. Recognition, warmth, anything. But what I saw instead was hesitation. Her smile faltered, just slightly. Her gaze dropped, just briefly, to the name tag pinned to my chest. Then she looked away and turned back to her friends, like I wasn't there. I inhaled slowly, deep enough to steady myself, shallow enough that no one would notice. That was when I heard it. Soft, but clear. "She's the one, right?" A woman's voice, somewhere behind me. "The one who paid for everything?" Another voice responded, quieter but sharper. "Yeah, that's what I heard. They joked about it when planning." A pause, then a small laugh. Honestly, the name tag is kind of funny. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to, because I already knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a printing error. It wasn't even a careless joke. It was intentional, designed, approved, and allowed. I lifted the champagne glass slightly, watching the bubbles rise to the surface. Small, delicate, temporary, just like the illusion I had been holding on to about this family. For years, I told myself that distance was normal, that times change, that younger generations express love differently, that maybe I was just being too sensitive. But sitting there, at table 12, with a name tag that reduced my entire life to a punchline, I realized something much simpler, much colder. I wasn't misunderstood. I was used. And now, I was being erased. Quietly, publicly, and with a smile. I set the glass down carefully on the table, still untouched. And for the first time that evening, I stopped waiting for someone to come over and fix it. Because deep down, I was beginning to understand no one was coming. I sat there for a few more seconds, staring at the untouched champagne in front of me. Then I did what I've done my entire life. I stood up and acted like everything was normal. Because that's what women like me were taught to do. Keep the peace. Don't embarrass the family. Smile, even when something feels wrong. So I picked up my purse, adjusted my dress, and walked toward the center of the room. Toward my family. Toward the people who had decided I was forgotten. The closer I got, the louder everything became. Laughter, glasses clinking, music swelling softly in the background. It felt like stepping into a world that looked familiar, but no longer included me. Daniel noticed me first. Of course he did. He always had a way of sensing when I was nearby, when he was younger, at least. His eyes met mine, and for a brief second, something flickered there. Recognition, then discomfort. "Mom," he said, forcing a smile as I approached. "You made it." I almost laughed at that. Made it. As if I had been invited like everyone else. As if I hadn't been the one making sure this entire day even existed. "I wouldn't miss it," I said calmly. My voice didn't shake. It never does when it matters. Linda turned toward me next. Her smile was quick, practiced. "Oh, Margaret," she said, her tone light, almost cheerful. "You look lovely." Her eyes dropped, just for a moment, to my name tag. And there it was again. That almost invisible pause. That tiny flicker of satisfaction she thought no one would notice. But I noticed. I always notice. "Thank you, Linda," I replied. Simple, polite, controlled. She tilted her head slightly. "Did you find your table all right?" "Everything organized." It sounded like a normal question. But it wasn't. There was something underneath it. A quiet confirmation. As if she already knew exactly where I had been placed. "I did," I said. "Table 12. Daniel shifted slightly beside her, adjusting his grip on his glass. He still hadn't mentioned the name tag. Not a word. Not even a glance long enough to acknowledge it. That told me everything I needed to know. He had seen it. And he had chosen silence. Before I could say anything else, another guest joined the circle. A tall man in his late 50s, well-dressed, confident. "Daniel," he said warmly, shaking his hand. "Beautiful event. You really outdid yourself." Daniel smiled, easing into the conversation immediately. "Thank you, Mark. We wanted it to be special." Mark's eyes turned toward me. "And you must be," Daniel cut in quickly, "my mother." Just that. No name. No introduction. No acknowledgement beyond the bare minimum. Mark nodded politely. "Nice to meet you." "Margaret," I said, extending my hand. He shook it, his grip firm but brief. Then his eyes dropped. To the name tag. I watched his expression change. Subtle, but clear. Confusion. Then awkwardness. He looked back up at me, as if trying to decide whether to say something. He didn't. People rarely do. Instead, he turned back to Daniel, and the conversation continued. Business, investments, connections I had nothing to do with. I stood there for a moment longer. Invisible again, even in the middle of the room. That's when Linda leaned slightly closer to one of the women beside her, thinking I wouldn't hear. "They love little touches like that," she said softly. "The guests remember details." The woman chuckled quietly. "Well, it definitely stands out." Linda smiled. And this time, there was no mistaking it. Pride. I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger. Not yet. Something steadier. Something clearer. Understanding. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't poor judgment. This was deliberate. A performance. And I was part of the entertainment. I stepped back slightly, giving them space. Not because I was pushed out, but because I chose to step away. There's a difference. As I turned, I caught my reflection briefly in one of the mirrored panels along the wall. The dress. The pearls. The posture. And that small, elegant card pinned to my chest. The forgotten old lady. For a moment, I studied it. Not as an insult, but as a message. Because sometimes, People reveal their intentions not through what they hide, but through what they're bold enough to show. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to fully accept before. This wasn't about one wedding. It wasn't about one name tag. It was about years. Years of small decisions, small exclusions, small moments where I had been gently moved aside, redefined, reduced. And I had let it happen. Because I believed in family. Because I believed love meant patience. Because I believed that if I kept giving, eventually, it would come back. I looked across the room again, at the decorations, at the guests, at the life I had helped fund, and I realized something else. I wasn't just forgotten. I had been replaced. Not physically, but emotionally, financially, functionally. I had become a resource, not a person, and once that resource had been used, I was no longer needed. I exhaled slowly, long controlled. Then I did something very simple. I smiled. Not the polite smile I had been wearing all evening. Not the one meant to reassure others. A different one. Quieter. Sharper. Because for the first time that day, I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't waiting for someone to explain. I wasn't hoping this was all a misunderstanding. I understood exactly what was happening. And more importantly, I understood what needed to happen next. I turned away from the crowd and walked back toward my table. Not defeated. Not humiliated. But thinking. Because people like Linda believed something very dangerous. They believed that silence meant weakness, that patience meant blindness, that kindness meant control. They believed they had already won. And that was their first mistake. I walked back to table 12 slowly, my steps measured, steady. The music had started to shift, something softer now, instrumental, the kind that fills space without demanding attention. Guests were taking their seats, chairs scraping gently against the floor, conversations settling into quieter tones. The wedding was about to begin. I sat down again, folding my hands neatly in my lap, the way I had done countless times at dinners, events, moments where I was expected to be present, but not necessarily included. From where I sat, the view of the stage was partially blocked by the tall centerpiece, white orchids cascading down like a curtain between me and the rest of the room. Fitting, I thought. A perfect metaphor. I could hear everything, but I couldn't quite see it. Just like the truth in this family for the past few years. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting my eyes move across the room. Not searching anymore, just observing. That's when the memories started to come back. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Small moments I had ignored, excused, explained away. Like the time last Christmas when I was told dinner had been moved to a different day, only to find out later, through a neighbor's social media post, that everyone had gathered without me. Or the birthday dinner for Daniel 2 years ago, when I arrived with a gift, only to realize the celebration had already happened the night before. Miscommunication, Linda had said with a light laugh. Always a reason. Always a soft explanation. Never anything direct enough to confront. At the time, I told myself it wasn't intentional. That people get busy. That families grow apart. That I was overthinking. But sitting there now, with that name tag still pinned to my chest, all those moments started to connect, like puzzle pieces finally forming a complete picture. This wasn't new. It had just been subtle. Until today. Today wasn't subtle. Today was public, deliberate, unmistakable. A server approached the table, placing a small program card in front of me. "Ceremony will begin in just a few minutes," he said politely. I nodded. "Thank you." I picked up the card, scanning it briefly. Emily Lawson. Bride. The same last name as mine. And yet, somehow, it felt like we belonged to different worlds now. I set the card down carefully. That's when I noticed someone approaching from the side. A man, older than most of the guests. Late 60s, maybe early 70s. Well-dressed, but not in the flashy way many of the others were. His suit was simple, classic. The kind of style that doesn't try to impress, but does anyway. He stopped beside my table. "Margaret." His voice was warm, familiar in a distant way. I looked up, searching his face. It took me a second. Then I recognized him. "Thomas." He smiled. "It's been a while." Thomas Reynolds. My late husband Robert's attorney. He had handled everything after Robert passed. Our estate, the paperwork, the things I couldn't bring myself to think about at the time. "Please," I said, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. "Sit." He did, setting his glasses down on the table before looking at me more closely. There was a pause. Not awkward, just observant. His eyes moved briefly to my name tag, and unlike the others, he didn't hide his reaction. His expression tightened, not with confusion, with disapproval. "That's unfortunate," he said quietly. I gave a small, controlled smile. "It seems to be a theme today." Thomas leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "I wasn't planning to bring this up here," he said. "But after seeing that, I think it might be time." Something in his tone shifted the air around us. Not dramatic, but serious, grounded. I felt my attention sharpen. "What do you mean?" I asked. He glanced around the room briefly, making sure no one was close enough to overhear. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. Cream-colored. Official. I recognized that type of envelope immediately. Legal. "Robert left additional instructions," Thomas said, placing it gently on the table in front of me. "A codicil," added shortly before he passed. My fingers didn't move right away. I just looked at it. Robert, my husband, gone for 3 years, and yet somehow still part of this moment. Why wasn't I told? I asked quietly. Thomas's expression softened. "He hoped it wouldn't be necessary," he said. "He believed your family would do the right thing without encouragement." I let out a slow breath. Robert always believed in people, sometimes more than they deserved. "And now?" I asked. Thomas met my eyes directly. "Now I believe you should know exactly what he put in place." I reached forward and picked up the envelope. It felt heavier than it should have. Not physically, but in meaning. I opened it carefully, sliding the document out. The text was formal, structured, precise. But the message was clear. Any family member who publicly disrespected or humiliated me would forfeit their inheritance. Not reduced, not adjusted. Forfeit. Entirely. I read it once, then again, just to be sure. When I looked up, Thomas was watching me closely. "Well?" he asked. I didn't answer right away, because in that moment, something shifted inside me. Not shock, not anger, clarity. Everything I had been feeling since I walked into that ballroom. Every doubt, every quiet realization, every moment of being pushed aside. It all aligned. Robert had seen it, even before I fully did, and he had prepared for it, not with confrontation, but with protection. I folded the document carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Then I placed it on the table in front of me. My hand rested lightly on top of it. Steady, certain. Around us, the room was filling, guests taking their seats, music softening further as the ceremony prepared to begin. From across the ballroom, I could see Daniel and Linda moving toward their table, toward the front, toward the spotlight. Unaware, completely unaware. I looked down briefly at the name tag pinned to my dress. The forgotten old lady. A small smile touched my lips. Not bitter, not hurt, different, because now I understood something they didn't. They thought this was the moment I disappeared, the moment I faded into the background, the moment I accepted my place. But they were wrong. This wasn't the moment I was forgotten. This was the moment I started remembering who I was. The music softened, and the lights dimmed just slightly. A quiet signal. The ceremony was about to begin. Guests shifted in their seats, conversations fading into a respectful hush. Chairs turned toward the aisle, programs lifted, phones lowered. Everyone preparing to witness something beautiful, something meaningful. I remained still, my hand resting lightly on the envelope Thomas had given me. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. I already knew what it meant. Across the room, the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. All eyes turned. And there she was, Emily, my granddaughter, standing at the entrance in her white gown, framed by soft light and anticipation. For a moment, everything else disappeared, because no matter what had happened, she was still the little girl I had once held in my arms. The one who used to fall asleep on my couch after watching cartoons. The one who used to reach for my hand without thinking. And now she stood there, grown, radiant, ready to begin a new life. The room rose to its feet. So did I, slowly, gracefully, because that's what I had always done. I stood. I supported. I showed up, even when it wasn't returned. The music changed, soft piano, gentle, emotional. Emily began walking down the aisle, her steps careful, measured. Her eyes were fixed ahead, toward the man waiting for her at the altar. She didn't look at me. Not once. And this time, I didn't expect her to. I watched her pass by the rows of guests, smiling faces, proud glances, whispered compliments about how beautiful she looked. And I realized something quietly. This wedding, it wasn't about me anymore. Maybe it never was. But what happened here, what they chose to do, that was about me. And now, so was what came next. The ceremony began. Words about love, commitment, family, promises spoken with conviction, vows exchanged in front of people who believed they were witnessing something genuine, something pure. I listened, calm, still, but inside, I was no longer the same woman who had walked into that ballroom earlier. Because now, I wasn't waiting to be acknowledged. I wasn't hoping for kindness. I wasn't trying to understand their behavior. I already did. And once you understand something fully, you stop making excuses for it. A soft applause filled the room as the officiant announced them husband and wife. Cheers followed. Laughter. Music rising again as the tension lifted and celebration returned. People hugged. Glasses clinked. Photographers moved quickly to capture every perfect moment. I remained where I was for a second longer. Then I sat back down. Slowly. Deliberately. Thomas leaned slightly closer. "You're very composed," he said quietly. I nodded once. "I've had practice." He gave a small, knowing look. "Yes," he said. "I imagine you have." I picked up the envelope again, sliding it gently into my purse this time. Not hiding it, just placing it where it belonged. Because I wasn't going to act on impulse. Not here. Not like this. That's what they would expect. Emotion. Reaction. A scene. But that's not how you handle something like this. Not when the truth is already on your side. "Are you planning to say anything?" Thomas asked. I glanced toward the center of the room, where Daniel and Linda were now surrounded by guests, smiling, celebrating, completely at ease. "Not yet," I said. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Timing matters," he said. "It always does," I replied. The reception portion began almost immediately after. Music shifted again, louder now, more upbeat. Servers moved quickly between tables, refilling glasses, placing plates, keeping everything flowing. I watched as Daniel stood to give a speech. My son, the boy who used to run to me when he fell, who once believed I could fix anything, now standing in front of a room full of people, holding a microphone, ready to speak about family, about love, about gratitude. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice confident, practiced. "We're so grateful to celebrate this special day with all of you." I listened. Every word. Carefully. He thanked the guests, the venue, the planning team, even the caterers. Then he smiled and turned toward Emily. "And of course, we want to thank everyone who helped make this day possible." There was a pause. A perfect moment. A chance. A simple acknowledgement. A name. Just one. Mine. But it didn't come. Instead, he gestured toward Linda, my incredible wife, who worked tirelessly to bring all of this together. Applause filled the room. Loud. Supportive. Celebratory. Linda smiled graciously, placing a hand over her chest as if humbled by the recognition. I felt it then. Not sharp. Not sudden. But steady. Final. The last piece. The last confirmation. It wasn't just that they forgot. It was that they chose not to remember. I lowered my gaze briefly to the table in front of me, to the neatly folded napkin, to the untouched glass from earlier. Then I looked back up, my expression calm, unchanged, because something inside me had settled completely now. No more doubt, no more hesitation, no more waiting. I understood the role they had assigned me, and I understood something else even more important. I didn't have to accept it. Across the room, laughter continued. Music played. People celebrated a beginning. But for me, something else had just ended. Quietly, without announcement, without drama, and in its place, something new was beginning. Not loud, not obvious, but certain. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, watching, waiting, because moments like this, they don't need to be rushed. They just need to be seen clearly and acted on at the right time. The music grew louder as the reception shifted into full celebration. Glasses were raised. Laughter filled the room again. Servers moved faster now, placing plates, pouring wine, keeping everything seamless, like a well-rehearsed performance. And that's exactly what it was. A performance. I sat there, watching it all unfold, no longer as a participant, but as an observer. There's a difference. When you're part of something, you feel it. When you step outside of it, you see it. Clearly, the bride and groom moved to the center of the dance floor for their first dance. Soft lights followed them, dimming the rest of the room just enough to make everything else fade into the background. Emily smiled up at her husband, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He whispered something to her. She laughed. It looked real. Maybe it was. I don't question that part. But I've learned something over the years. Just because something looks real doesn't mean everything around it is. Applause filled the room as the music swelled. Phones lifted into the air, recording, capturing, preserving a moment that would be replayed later as proof of happiness, proof of family, proof of love. I glanced down briefly at my own hands. Still, calm, unshaken. That surprised me. A few hours ago, something like this would have hurt deeply. Now, it didn't, because I had stopped expecting anything from them. And once you remove expectation, you remove disappointment. A server approached my table again. Dinner will be served shortly, he said politely. Would you prefer chicken or salmon? Salmon, please, I replied. Simple, normal, as if everything was exactly as it should be. He nodded and moved on. Across the room, Daniel and Linda were making their rounds, table to table, greeting guests, smiling, thanking people for coming. They were good at it. Very good. People leaned in when they spoke. They laughed at the right moments. They gave just enough attention to make everyone feel included. Everyone. Except, they hadn't come to table 12 yet. I didn't check the time. I didn't need to. You can feel it when you're being avoided. It has a rhythm, a pattern, and once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Thomas leaned slightly closer again. They're working the room, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. They're very thorough. There was a small pause. Then he added, they haven't come over here. I turned my head slightly, looking toward the dance floor again. No, I said. They haven't. Another pause. This one heavier. Does that surprise you? He asked. I thought about that for a second. Honestly. Then I shook my head. No, I said. Not anymore. He nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something for him. Dinner was served soon after. Plates placed carefully in front of each guest. The smell of warm food filled the air, blending with the already rich atmosphere of the room. I picked up my fork, took a small bite, chewed slowly, not because I was hungry, but because I understood something important. Normal actions make people comfortable, and comfortable people make mistakes. Across the room, I saw Linda glance in my direction. Just briefly, her eyes moved to my table, then away again. Checking, monitoring, making sure everything was still contained, that I was still quiet, still in place, still playing the role she had assigned me. I met her gaze, held it, just for a second longer than expected. Then I smiled. Not warmly, not coldly, just enough. Her expression shifted slightly. Confusion. It was subtle, but it was there. Because that smile didn't match the situation. And people like Linda notice things like that. She turned away quickly, resuming her conversation with another guest. But I had already seen it. The first crack. Small. Almost invisible. But real. Thomas noticed it too. You're thinking something, he said quietly. I set my fork down, folded my napkin carefully beside my plate. Then I leaned back slightly in my chair. Yes, I said. I am. He waited. Didn't push. Didn't interrupt. That's why I always respected him. He understood timing. I'm not going to confront them, I said. Not here. He nodded once. That would be unproductive. Yes, I agreed. And predictable. I glanced around the room again. At the guests. At the laughter. At the carefully constructed image of a perfect family. They expect emotion, I continued. They expect reaction. They expect me to feel small. Thomas's expression remained steady. And you don't, he asked. I looked down briefly at the name tag still pinned to my dress. The forgotten old lady. Then I looked back up. No, I said. I feel clear. That was the right word. Clear. No confusion. No doubt. No hesitation. Just understanding. They think this is the moment they define me, I said quietly. But they're wrong. Thomas leaned back slightly, studying me. And what moment is this then, he asked. I let a small pause settle between us. Not for effect. Just because I meant it. This, I said, is the moment I decide what happens next. The music shifted again. Faster now. Guests began moving toward the dance floor, energy rising, conversations blending into movement and sound. The reception had reached its peak. The perfect time. Because when everything feels right, no one is prepared for anything else. I picked up my purse slowly. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just deliberate. Thomas noticed. Are you leaving? He asked. I shook my head. No, I said. Not yet. I stood up, smoothed my dress, adjusted the small card on my chest one last time. The forgotten old lady. I almost appreciated it now, because it had shown me everything I needed to see. I looked toward the center of the room, toward Daniel, toward Linda, toward the life they believed they controlled. Then I took a quiet breath and stepped forward, because the truth is, I wasn't forgotten. I had just been watching, and now I was ready. I didn't rush. That's the first thing you need to understand. People expect a reaction to be fast, emotional, impulsive, loud. That's what makes it easy to dismiss. But when you move slowly, when you choose each step, people start to notice, and they don't know why. I walked across the ballroom floor with the same calm pace I had used all evening. No sudden movements, no raised voice, just quiet intention. The music was loud now. Guests were dancing, laughing, fully absorbed in the celebration, which made it the perfect moment. Because when people feel safe, they stop paying attention. I moved toward the center of the room, where Daniel and Linda stood with a small group, drinks in hand, smiling like nothing in the world could touch them, like everything was exactly as it should be. I stopped just a few feet away, close enough to be seen, not close enough to interrupt. At first, no one noticed. Then Daniel glanced up. His smile froze for just a second. "Mom," he said, a little louder than necessary, as if to normalize the moment. "Everything okay?" I held his gaze. "Yes," I said. My voice was calm. "Even. Too even." Linda turned next. Her expression shifted quickly, polite surprise, then controlled composure. "Margaret," she said, "are you enjoying yourself?" That question again. Always that question. As if enjoyment was the measure of whether I belonged. "I am," I said. And I meant it. Because clarity has a strange way of feeling like peace. There was a small pause. Guests around them started to quiet slightly. Not completely, but enough. People sense when something is about to happen, even if they don't understand it yet. I reached up calmly and touched the name tag on my chest. Just lightly. Enough to draw attention to it. "I wanted to thank you," I said. Daniel blinked. "For what?" he asked. I gave a small smile. "For making things so clear tonight." Linda's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger. In calculation. She was trying to understand where this was going. "Good. Let her." "I'm not sure what you mean," she said carefully. Of course she didn't. Or at least, she wouldn't admit that she did. I lowered my hand from the name tag. "You gave me a title," I said. "The forgotten old lady." A few people nearby shifted. Uncomfortable now. Listening more closely. Daniel let out a short laugh. "Oh, Mom, come on," he said. "That's just a joke." I finished for him. He hesitated. Just for a second. Linda stepped in smoothly. "It was meant to be lighthearted," she said. "Something memorable for the guests." "Memorable?" I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "It was." Silence settled a little heavier around us. Not complete, but enough. I reached into my purse. Slowly, deliberately. No sudden movement. No drama. Just a simple action. And I took out the envelope. The same one Thomas had given me. I held it lightly in my hand. Daniel's eyes flicked to it. "What's that?" he asked. "Something your father left behind," I said. That got his attention. Fully. Linda's too. I saw it in their faces. That shift. From control to uncertainty. He added it shortly before he passed. I continued. A small detail. Something he hoped would never be needed. No one spoke now. Even the guests nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. Because tone matters. And mine had changed. Not louder. Not sharper. Just final. I opened the envelope. Took out the document. Didn't rush. Didn't look down. I already knew what it said. "I think it's time we read it," I said. Daniel frowned slightly. "Mom, this isn't really the place for—" "No," I said gently. "It is." And that was enough to stop him. Because when your voice doesn't rise, but doesn't bend either, people pause. I glanced briefly at Thomas, who was now standing a few steps behind me. He gave a small nod. That was all I needed. I looked back at Daniel, at Linda, at the people who had decided I was something to label, something to reduce, something to forget. Then I spoke. Clear. Steady. Every word placed exactly where it needed to be. Any family member who publicly humiliates or disrespects Margaret Lawson, I let the words settle for a second. Watch their expressions shift. Will immediately forfeit any and all rights to inheritance from the Lawson estate. Silence. Complete this time. Heavy. Unavoidable. Daniel stared at me. Confusion first, then realization. Linda didn't speak, but her face changed. Subtly. The color drained just slightly. Enough. What is that supposed to mean? Daniel asked. I folded the document calmly. It means, I said, that tonight wasn't just memorable for your guests. I let my eyes move briefly to the name tag on my chest, then back to them. It was significant. Linda stepped forward slightly. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice controlled but tighter now. You can't just. I didn't, I replied. Your father did. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't argue. I simply stated. And that's what made it land. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. This doesn't make any sense, he said. We were just making a joke? I asked again. He didn't answer. Because now, it didn't sound like a joke anymore. I looked at him for a moment. Really looked. Not at the man in the suit, but at the boy he used to be. And I realized something quietly. He hadn't changed all at once. It had happened slowly, piece by piece, until this moment felt normal to him. And that was the real loss. I took a small step back, not retreating, just creating space. I'm not here to argue, I said. I'm here to inform you. I slipped the document back into the envelope. Calm, precise. Enjoy the rest of the evening, I added. My tone didn't change, not even at the end. Then I turned and walked away. No rush, no hesitation. Behind me, I could feel it. The shift, the whispers starting, the tension spreading, the realization settling in. Because moments like this, they don't explode. They unfold, quietly, completely. And once they do, there's no going back. I didn't look back. That's important. Because when you do something like that, when you shift the balance in a room, you don't turn around to measure the reaction. You already know it's there. You feel it. And I felt it the moment I took my first step away. The music was still playing. The lights were still warm. The guests were still dressed in silk and black tie. But something had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like a crack running beneath polished marble. Invisible at first glance, but impossible to ignore once you know it's there. I walked back toward table 12. The same table, the same seat, the same view partially blocked by flowers. But it didn't feel the same anymore. Because I didn't feel the same. I sat down slowly, placing my purse beside me. My hands rested lightly in my lap again. Steady, calm, exactly as they had been all evening. Across the room, I could see it beginning. Daniel hadn't moved. Linda hadn't spoken. Not yet. They were still standing there, processing, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to decide how to respond, and more importantly, trying to decide who had heard. Because that's what matters to people like them. Not truth, not intent, exposure. A few guests nearby leaned closer to each other. Whispers, quick glances, subtle shifts in posture. Nothing obvious, but enough. Always enough. Thomas returned to his seat beside me a moment later. He didn't say anything at first, just adjusted his jacket and looked out across the room, watching, like I was. They didn't expect that, he said finally. No, I replied. They didn't. A pause. Then he added, you handled it precisely. I gave a small nod. Precision matters. Because it does. Especially when emotion would only weaken the message. Across the ballroom, I saw Linda move first. Of course she did. She always recovered quickly. That was her strength. She leaned toward Daniel, speaking quietly but firmly. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Her posture told me everything. Control, containment, strategy. Daniel, on the other hand, he looked shaken, not broken, but unsettled. His shoulders tighter, his movements less certain. That was new. For the first time that evening, he didn't look like he knew exactly what to do. And that was something he wasn't used to. They'll come over, Thomas said. I looked at him briefly. Yes, I said. They will. Because now, they had to. Dinner plates were being cleared. Music softened again, shifting into something slower. The kind of transition that signals the evening is moving forward. But for them, everything had just stopped. I reached for my glass of water this time. Not the champagne. The water. Simple. Grounding. I took a small sip. Set it down. Waited. And then, they came. Daniel first. Linda just half a step behind. Always half a step. Close enough to guide. Far enough to observe. They stopped at the edge of the table. Daniel's expression was controlled, but not steady. Mom, he said. His voice lower now. Quieter. Different. Can we talk? I looked up at him. Not cold, not warm, just neutral. We are talking, I said. He glanced briefly at Thomas, then back at me. Privately, he added. There it was. Of course. Control the setting. Control the narrative. Control the damage. I shook my head slightly. No, I said. Not privately. Linda stepped in smoothly. This isn't the place for a misunderstanding like this, she said. Still calm. Still polished. Still trying. There's no misunderstanding, I replied. Simple. Direct. Final. A small silence followed. Not long, but enough. Daniel exhaled slowly. You're taking this too far, he said. I tilted my head just slightly. Too far, I repeated. He hesitated. Yes, he said. It was just a joke. You're making it into something bigger than it is. I held his gaze, and for the first time that night, there was no softness left in mine. It was already something bigger, I said quietly. You just didn't notice. Linda crossed her arms lightly. A subtle shift. Defensive. We didn't mean anything by it, she said. Meaning. Such a convenient word. I'm sure you didn't, I replied. And yet, you did it anyway. Another pause. Longer this time. Because now, they were running out of easy explanations. Daniel rubbed his forehead briefly. This inheritance thing, he said. You're not seriously going to. I'm not doing anything, I interrupted gently. Your father already did. Again, that same line. And it landed just as firmly the second time. Linda's jaw tightened slightly. You're willing to destroy your own family over this? She asked. I looked at her. Really looked. For the first time, without hesitation. No, I said. I'm just no longer willing to pretend it isn't already broken. That was the moment. The real one. Not when I spoke. Not when I revealed the document. But when they understood. I wasn't going back. Not to silence. Not to excuses. Not to being reduced to something small enough to ignore. Daniel looked at me then. Longer. Searching. Maybe for the version of me he used to know. The one who would smooth things over. The one who would let it go. The one who would choose peace. Even if it meant losing herself. But that version wasn't sitting at that table anymore. And I think, deep down, he realized it. We'll talk about this later, he said finally. A statement, not a question. I didn't respond. Because I didn't need to. He waited. Just for a second. Then nodded once. And turned away. Linda followed. But not before giving me one last look. Sharp. Measured. Different now. Not confident. Not in control. Aware. They walked back into the crowd. Into the music. Into the celebration that no longer felt quite the same. I sat there. Still. Quiet. And for the first time that night, I felt something settle completely inside me. Not anger. Not sadness. Something else. Something stronger. Peace. Because when you finally stop accepting what diminishes you, you don't lose anything. You just stop losing yourself. The music didn't stop. That's what I noticed first. Even after everything that had just happened, the music kept playing. Soft at first, then rising again, as if nothing had shifted. As if the room could simply move forward without acknowledging what had just settled beneath the surface. And in a way, that's exactly what people were trying to do. Move on. Pretend. Continue the celebration. Because facing something uncomfortable in the middle of a perfect evening, that requires more honesty than most people are willing to give. I remained seated at table 12, exactly where I had been placed, exactly where they thought I belonged. But now, it felt different. Not because of the table, because of me. I picked up my glass again. This time, I actually took a sip. The water was cool, steady, grounding. Across the room, the dance floor filled again. Guests laughed a little louder than before. Conversations picked up, slightly forced at first, then gradually more natural. People adjusting, rebalancing. That's what humans do. But something had changed, even if they didn't say it out loud. I could see it in the way people looked at Daniel now. At Linda. Not directly, not confrontationally, but differently. There was curiosity now. A question lingering just beneath the surface. What just happened? And more importantly, what does it mean? Thomas leaned back in his chair, watching the room with the same quiet attention I had. It's spreading, he said under his breath. I nodded slightly. Yes, I replied. Because truth has a way of moving through a room without needing to be announced. It travels in glances, in whispers, in silence. And once it starts, it doesn't stop. I noticed a woman at a nearby table lean toward her companion, speaking softly while glancing in my direction. Another guest across the room paused mid-conversation, looking briefly toward Daniel, before lowering his voice. Small things, but they add up. They always do. This wasn't loud. This wasn't dramatic. But it was real. And real things don't need volume to be powerful. A few minutes passed. Maybe more. Time moves differently when you're not waiting for anything anymore. I wasn't watching the clock. I wasn't anticipating the next moment. I was simply present. And then something else shifted. Daniel stepped away from the crowd. Not toward me. Not yet. Toward the bar. He stood there for a second longer than necessary, his back slightly turned, shoulders tense. He picked up a drink, took a sip, then set it down again almost immediately. Restless. Unsettled. Linda stayed where she was. Still speaking. Still smiling. But I could see it now. The effort. The control. The calculation behind every movement. Because maintaining an image is much harder once it's been questioned. Thomas followed my gaze. He's realizing the implications, he said quietly. Yes, I said. He is. And that realization doesn't happen all at once. It comes in layers. First confusion, then doubt, then understanding. I leaned back slightly in my chair, not relaxing, just settling, because there was nothing left for me to do. Not tonight, not here. I had already said what needed to be said. And once something is said clearly enough, you don't repeat it. You let it work. Across the room, Emily returned to the dance floor, pulled in by her friends, laughing again, spinning under the lights. For a moment, she looked untouched by everything that had happened. Maybe she was. Or maybe she simply didn't know yet. That thought crossed my mind. Briefly, then passed. Because tonight wasn't about explaining anything to her. Not yet. There's a time for everything. And this was not that time. A slow song began to play. Couples moved closer together, the energy of the room shifting again, quieter, more intimate. I watched as Daniel returned to Linda's side. He said something. She listened. Then her posture changed. Subtly, but enough. She turned her head slightly and looked at me again. This time longer. This time without pretending it was accidental. Our eyes met across the room. And for the first time that night, there was no performance in her expression. No polished smile. No social mask. Just awareness. Clear. Undeniable. She knew. Not just about the document. Not just about the inheritance. She knew that something else had changed. Something she couldn't control. And that unsettled her more than anything else. I held her gaze. Didn't look away. Didn't react. Just remained. Because sometimes the strongest position is simply refusing to move. She broke eye contact first. Turned back to Daniel. Said something quickly. He nodded. And just like that, they made a decision. I could see it. The shift. The alignment. They were no longer reacting. They were preparing. But not for me. For the consequences. I looked down briefly at the table in front of me. At the folded napkin. At the empty glass. At the place where I had been sitting all evening, quietly absorbing everything. Then I looked back up. Calm. Certain. Because I understood something now that I hadn't fully accepted before. This wasn't just a moment. It was a turning point. Not for them. For me. For years, I had adjusted. Adapted. Made space. Made excuses. Reduced myself to fit into a version of family that no longer truly included me. But tonight, that ended. Not loudly. Not with anger. Not with blame. Just ended. And in its place, something else began. Something quieter. But far more solid. I sat there a little longer. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. Watching. Observing. Letting the room settle into its new shape. Because once truth enters a space, everything rearranges around it, even if no one says a word. And I knew, without needing to be told, that nothing in that family would feel quite the same after tonight. The energy in the room kept moving. That's how events like this survive tension. They don't stop. They don't pause. They flow around it. Music shifted again, faster this time. A few guests returned to the dance floor, eager to bring the mood back up, to restore what had been slightly unsettled. Because no one wants to admit when something has changed. They just try to cover it, smooth it out, continue. I sat there, watching it all, and I realized something important. They weren't ignoring what happened. They were managing it. There's a difference. Linda especially. I could see it clearly now. She moved differently. Still smiling. Still graceful. But more controlled. More deliberate. Every interaction now had a purpose. Every laugh measured. Every gesture placed carefully, like she was rebuilding something invisible. Reputation. Perception. Control. She leaned into conversations a little more than before. Touched arms lightly. Held eye contact just a second longer. Reassurance. That's what she was offering. Not to me. To them. To the room. To the people who had heard just enough to start asking questions. Daniel stayed close to her now. Not leading. Following. That was new. I watched him speak to a group near the bar. His smile returned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes this time. There was something behind it. Calculation. Uncertainty. Awareness. He knew. And once you know, you can't unknow. Thomas adjusted his glasses beside me. They're stabilizing, he said quietly. I nodded. Yes, I replied. But it won't hold. Because something like this, it doesn't disappear. It lingers. It settles into people's thoughts long after the music fades. I reached for my purse again. Not hurried. Not hidden. Just intentional. I took out the envelope once more. Not to read it. Not to show it. Just to hold it. Because sometimes, you don't need to do anything with the truth. You just need to know you have it. Across the room, I noticed someone new approaching Daniel. An older gentleman. Well-dressed. Serious. Not smiling. I recognized him after a moment. One of Robert's former business partners. A man who understood value. Not just money. Reputation. He spoke to Daniel briefly. Quietly. But firmly. Daniel's expression shifted again. Tighter. More focused. Linda joined them quickly. Too quickly. That told me everything. This wasn't just spreading socially anymore. It was reaching people who understood what it meant. And that changes everything. Because embarrassment can be ignored. But consequence cannot. Thomas followed my gaze. They're connecting the dots, he said. Yes, I replied. And they're starting to see the full picture. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Relaxed. Not because I was comfortable, but because I no longer needed to anticipate anything. The next part was already happening. I didn't have to push it. I didn't have to guide it. I just had to let it unfold. A few minutes later, I saw Daniel excuse himself from the group. He didn't look at me. Not yet. He walked toward the side of the ballroom, pulling his phone out, stepping into a quieter corner. Private. Urgent. Linda remained where she was, but her attention had shifted. She wasn't engaging anymore. She was watching, tracking, managing. But even the best control has limits. And this had already moved beyond her reach. I placed the envelope back into my purse, closed it, set it beside me. Done. Because the moment of action had passed. Now, it was about outcome. The music continued. The laughter returned in waves. But underneath it, something steady remained. A quiet tension, a shared awareness, a subtle distance forming between people who, just an hour ago, had been completely at ease. And I understood something clearly then. This wasn't just about what I had said. It was about what it revealed. Not just about them. About the entire structure around them. The assumptions. The dynamics. The roles everyone had quietly accepted. And once those are exposed, they don't go back the same way. I stood up slowly. Not because I needed to. Because I wanted to. Thomas looked at me. Leaving, he asked. I shook my head. Not yet. I adjusted my dress again. Simple. Calm. The same way I had at the beginning of the evening. But this time, it meant something different. Because at the beginning, I had been preparing to be part of their event. Now, I was simply deciding when I would step away from it. There's a difference. I looked around the room one more time. At the lights, the decorations, the people, the life I had helped support. And I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel regret. I felt distance. Clear. Clean. Final. Across the room, Daniel returned from his call. His face was different now. More serious. More aware. He spoke to Linda again. Short. Direct. And this time, she didn't argue. She listened. Really. Listened. Because now, it wasn't about managing perception anymore. It was about understanding reality. I watched them for a moment longer. Then I looked away. Because I didn't need to see the rest. I already knew how it would unfold. Not tonight. Not completely. But it had started. And once something like this starts, it doesn't stop. It carries forward. Into conversations. Into decisions. Into consequences. I picked up my purse. Held it lightly at my side. And for the first time that evening, I felt something simple. Relief. Not because of what I had done, but because of what I had finally stopped doing. Waiting. Explaining. Accepting less than what I deserved. I took a small breath. Steady. Quiet. And stood there for just a moment longer. Because sometimes, the most powerful part of a story is not what you say next. It's what you no longer need to say at all. Daniel didn't come back to me immediately. That told me everything. Because when someone avoids you after something like that, it's not confusion anymore. It's calculation. I remained standing for a moment, then slowly sat back down at table 12. Not out of habit, out of control. Because I chose when to move now. Not them. Across the room, I could see Daniel and Linda standing closer than before, their conversation no longer casual. Their posture had changed, less open, more contained. Private, in a public space. That's when I noticed something else. People weren't approaching them the same way anymore. Before, guests had walked up easily, smiling, relaxed, eager to connect. Now, there was hesitation, a pause, a subtle shift before stepping in. Because once doubt enters a room, it changes how people engage, even if no one says it out loud. Thomas leaned slightly toward me again. They're being approached differently, he said. Yes, I replied. They are. And that difference, that's where consequences begin. Not in loud confrontations, in quiet distance, in changed behavior, in the way people start choosing their words more carefully, or choosing not to engage at all. A woman I recognized, one of Linda's close friends, walked up to them, smiling as she spoke. But her smile didn't last. Not fully. It flickered. And when Linda responded, it was sharper than before. Controlled, but thinner. That was new. Because people like Linda don't lose composure easily, unless something has shifted underneath them. Daniel, on the other hand, he looked tired. Not physically, mentally. Like someone who had just realized the ground beneath him wasn't as stable as he thought. He glanced around the room more often now. Not to enjoy it, to assess it, to measure who had heard, who was watching, who was thinking. That's when it truly settles in. Not when something is said, but when you realize it can't be contained. I folded my hands gently in my lap. Still, calm, because I understood something they didn't. This wasn't about what I would do next. This was about what they had already done. And once something is revealed, it doesn't need help to grow. A few minutes later, Daniel finally started walking toward me. Alone this time. Linda stayed behind. Watching. Always watching. He stopped a few feet from the table. Didn't sit. Didn't smile. Mom, he said. His voice was quieter than before. Not controlled. Careful. I looked up at him. Yes. He hesitated. That was new. Daniel never hesitated when he was younger. He always knew what to say. Or at least, he thought he did. Now, there was a gap. A space between thought and speech. We need to fix this, he said. Fix. I almost smiled. Because some things aren't meant to be fixed. They tried to explain it to me. He continued, nodding slightly toward Linda across the room. It wasn't meant the way it came out. I held his gaze. Then how was it meant? I asked. He opened his mouth, paused, closed it again. Because there isn't a softer version of disrespect. There isn't a better explanation for something done deliberately. There's only intention. An outcome. It was just a bad decision, he said finally. I nodded once. Yes, I said. It was. A small silence settled between us. Not heavy, not tense, just honest. Then let's move on, he added quickly. There's no reason to take this further. Move on. That phrase. I've heard it my entire life. Usually from people who benefit from things staying exactly the same. I leaned back, slightly in my chair, studying him. You want to move on? I said. Yes, he replied. From what? I asked. He frowned slightly. From this situation, he said. From what happened tonight. I shook my head gently. No, I said. You want to move on from the consequences. That landed. I could see it in his face. Not anger. Recognition. Because deep down, he understood. Even if he didn't want to admit it. This doesn't have to be that serious, he said. It already is, I replied. Quiet. Final. He ran his hand through his hair again. A habit he hadn't had since he was a teenager. That told me more than his words ever could. I'm your son, he said. And there it was. The card people play when logic no longer works. Relationship. History. Emotion. I know, I said. And I'm your mother. We held eye contact. Longer this time. Because this wasn't about winning. This was about truth. And truth doesn't rush. I didn't raise you to treat people this way. I continued. My voice didn't rise. Didn't shake. But it carried. Because it was real. He looked down. Just briefly. Then back up. You're making this bigger than it needs to be, he said again. But this time, it sounded weaker. Because repetition doesn't make something true. It just shows you don't have anything new to say. I stood up slowly. Not abruptly. Not emotionally. Just done. This isn't about tonight, I said. It never was. He didn't respond. Because now, he was starting to understand. All the small things. All the quiet moments. All the times I had stepped back without saying anything. They weren't forgotten. They were remembered. And now, they mattered. I won't argue with you, I added. I don't need to. I picked up my purse, held it lightly at my side. Daniel watched me, not stopping me, not following, just watching, because something in him knew. This wasn't a conversation he could control anymore. Across the room, Linda stood still, her expression unreadable now. Not confident, not defensive, aware. I met her gaze one last time. No words, none needed, because everything had already been said, not just tonight, over years. And finally, it had been heard. I turned, and this time, I didn't pause, because sometimes, the most powerful moment isn't when everything collapses. It's when you realize you don't need to stay and watch it happen. I walked slowly toward the exit, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel every step. The music behind me grew louder again. Someone had turned it up, trying to pull the room back into celebration. Laughter followed, a little too bright, a little too quick. Like nothing had happened. Like everything was still perfect. But I knew better. Because once something cracks, it never goes back to what it was. The ballroom door stood open ahead of me. Soft light from the hallway spilling in, quieter, calmer. Almost like another world waiting just outside. I didn't rush to reach it. I passed by tables filled with people who avoided looking directly at me now. Not out of disrespect. Out of awareness. Because they knew. Even if they didn't know everything. They knew enough. And sometimes, enough is all it takes. I reached the doorway and paused for just a moment. Not to look back, but to breathe. Slow. Steady. Because for the first time that night, I wasn't holding anything in. No expectations. No disappointment. No need for anyone to understand. Behind me, I could hear footsteps. Faster. Unsteady. Mom, wait. Daniel. Of course. I closed my eyes briefly. Not in frustration. Not in anger. Just acknowledgement. Then I turned. He stopped a few feet away, slightly out of breath, his tie loosened, his expression no longer controlled. No performance now. No audience. Just him. And me. Please don't leave like this, he said. I looked at him. Really looked. And for a moment, I saw him again. Not the man in the suit. Not the voice giving speeches. The boy. The one who used to hold my hand in parking lots. The one who used to ask me if everything would be okay. I let that memory sit there. Then I let it go. I'm not leaving like this, I said quietly. I'm leaving clearly. He shook his head. This can be fixed, he said quickly. We'll talk. We'll figure it out. Just don't walk away. I tilted my head slightly. You've had years to figure it out, I said. Silence. Heavy. Honest. This was just one night, he added. No, I replied. It was just the first time you didn't hide it. That landed. I could see it. Because truth doesn't need volume. It just needs the right moment. He took a step closer. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he said. And I believed him. Not because it excused anything, but because people rarely mean to lose something important. They just don't notice it slipping away. Until it's gone. I know, I said. And that was the kindest thing I had said all night. He looked at me then. Searching again. Hoping. Then stay, he said. I smiled. Soft. Not bitter. Not cold. Just real. I already stayed, I said. For a very long time. Another silence. Different this time. Because now, there was nothing left to argue. Nothing left to explain. He understood. Maybe not completely. Maybe not comfortably. But enough. And that's all truth ever asks for. I reached up slowly and touched the name tag one last time. The forgotten old lady. I unpinned it carefully. No rush. No hesitation. Then I stepped forward and placed it gently into his hand. He looked down at it, then back at me. Confused. Quiet. Keep it, I said. Not as a joke. As a reminder. I didn't need to say more. Because the meaning was already there. I stepped back. Turned again. And this time, I didn't stop. The hallway was quiet. Soft lighting. Muted sounds from the ballroom fading behind me with every step. Each one lighter than the last. Because I wasn't carrying anything anymore. Not their expectations. Not their version of me. Not the role they had assigned. I walked past the mirrors lining the wall. Caught my reflection briefly. The same dress. The same pearls. The same woman. But not the same presence. Because something had shifted. Not outside. Inside. And that's the only shift that ever really matters. When I reached the front doors of the hotel, the night air met me gently, cool, calm, real. No music, no performance, just quiet. I stepped outside, and for a moment, I stood there, looking up at the sky, breathing in something that felt like space, like possibility, like truth without decoration. I thought about Robert, what he had done, what he had seen before I did, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone, because he had protected me, not from them, from losing myself. I took a step forward, then another. The sound of the ballroom faded completely behind me, and just like that, it was over. Not the story, just that chapter. Because I wasn't forgotten. I had just been watching, and now, I was finally walking away on my own terms.